Good afternoon. My name is Andy Corrigan. I'm the Interim Dean of Libraries here at Tulane. Having worked with library collections throughout my own professional life, it's a real pleasure for me to introduce this next session. Richard Ovenden is librarian at the Bodleian Library, which is at the University of Oxford, and one of the world's great research libraries. He's also director of the Bodleian Center for the Study of the Book. He is a fellow of Balliol College, Oxford, fellow of the Society for Antiquaries in London, and a member of the American Philosophical Society. His book, Burning the Books, A History of the Deliberate Destruction of Knowledge, was published by Harvard's Belknap Press and has been described as an engaging and timely study of the villains who destroy written records of the past and of the heroes who try to stop them. Michael Kuczynski is professor of medieval literature and book history here at Tulane, where he has served 3 terms as chair of the English department and is currently vice chair of the University Senate. Since the 1980s, when he was a graduate student, he has worked extensively on medieval manuscripts in Oxford at the Bodleian Library. In 2019, he published with the Oxford University Press a 2-volume study of one of the library's manuscripts, a glossed Wycliffite Psalter. Mike will be interviewing Richard this afternoon about burning the books, censorship, and other book historical matters. I think we'll try to leave 10 minutes at the end for questions from you all. So enjoy the conversation, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guest.
As Andy mentioned, I've been going to Oxford and visiting the place that Richard runs, that he's head of, the great Bodleian Library, since the 1980s. So it's a really special pleasure for me, Richard, to be with you today to talk with you not only about the Bodleian, but about this book. We were talking beforehand, every book has a special history to it, and I thought I'd start by asking you how you came to write this book.
Okay, but first I'd just like to say how wonderful it is to be here in New Orleans, and just to say how welcome I've been made in this amazing city, in this wonderful university, in this unsurpassable book festival. So thank you for having me, and thank you for coming. Okay, so I wrote the book for perhaps 3 or 4 reasons. One of them was just a general sense that as a librarian, and I run a famous library, but libraries, the work that libraries and archives do does not get discussed enough in the public sphere, or at least it didn't when I began to write the book. So I thought, how can I engage a broader public, and particularly a public which might include decision makers in other parts of life, with the issues that libraries face? And there were 2 particular triggers for me actually going to write the book. One was visiting Berlin. We have a partnership with the Berlin State Library, and I was going to a meeting and I was early. And I was walking around Unter den Linden, about to go to my meeting, killing some time, and I stumbled upon the place where on the 10th of May 1933 the Nazis burned a huge pyre of books and students chanted a kind of celebratory series of chants as they set these books on fire. And there's a very moving plaque to this day. If you go, I recommend you go if you visit Berlin. And it struck me that my mum was alive when this happened, the 10th of May 1933. She's still alive today, I'm pleased to say. But we forget these things at our peril. And, I quote Heinrich Heine's famous quote at the beginning of the book, "When they burn books, soon they will burn human beings." And that's exactly, obviously, what happened following the 10th of May 1933. But the most immediate trigger was reading a newspaper article, and I was just hearing Carl Bernstein and Jason Berry yesterday, an amazing talk about the role of journalists. But I read a journalistic account in 2018, and at the time in the UK, the immigration policy was absolutely at the top of the political agenda, and the government's policy at the time was called the hostile environment. So you can sense that this was, this was a problematic issue for British citizens who were being forced to prove their right to remain. Many of them have been in the UK for decades, and they were being forced to prove documentation that they could stay in the UK. Many of them were deported, and there were kind of terrible accounts of the suffering that these people faced. And I read this account that the same government department instigating the hostile environment destroyed an archive of documents that those same individuals could have used to prove their right to remain. And this seemed to me to be a classic example of the social importance of the preservation of knowledge. So in the kind of heat of the moment, I wrote an op-ed for the Financial Times. It was published, and the next day a publisher wrote to me and said, this will make an interesting book. So there you are.
So your subtitle is The Deliberate Destruction of Knowledge. And, this is a book, it's incredibly dense with detail, and yet at the same time is very readable, which is a real achievement. I mean, I'm envious. But it's a book about power. It's not just a book about books, about documents, about preserving documents. It's about who has the power on the one hand to preserve knowledge, and those forces on the other hand that have the power to destroy it. Could you talk a bit about that, the political dimension of the book? The two examples that you just gave are,
yes,
are kind of textbook examples, but the power both of preserving on the one hand knowledge, which is a power that you have as a librarian, and then the power to destroy.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm a historian, so the book is a historical survey of maybe 5,000 years of knowledge being the battleground for the seizure of power, and authoritarianism in many of its forms, whether that's political, cultural, religious, have taken the domain of knowledge as the source of power, to seize it, to destroy it, to deny it. And we have to sort of recognize the flip side of that if there are forces that seek to destroy knowledge, it must be useful. And I think from the way in which, in some of the accounts I take for example, there's a story, one chapter called The Paper Brigade, about a community in Lithuania, in the city of Vilnius, or Vilna as it was known then, who risked their lives to save a trove of material describing their community, the everyday life of the Jewish community in Eastern Europe. And they were willing to lose their lives. I'm not recommending this to librarians generally, but there are many instances in history. There's this human desire to keep knowledge, to preserve the identity of their communities, to preserve the rights of citizens, to preserve the ideas of our civilization. And I think that's worth drawing attention to, particularly at a time where across the globe, knowledge is under attack right now. Talk to our colleagues in Ukraine. They know about this for real.
Yeah. I mean, it goes without saying at a book festival that there are a lot of people, this room is filled with them, who love books, but the affection, that we have for books is something that runs deeper than, being assigned something to study for a course, or belonging to a book club, or having a few favorite books. There seems to be something, and you touch on this at various points in your book, something in the human condition that that is compelled to record what we have done, and not just to record what we have done, but to preserve the record of what we have done. I was struck by, in addition to being a history, there are, because you're writing a history here, there are some very strong personalities who you give character sketches of. For instance, Henry VIII, there's a very strong personality, someone who was involved both in the preservation but also the destruction of knowledge.
And that's the Reformation in England was a perfect example of the seizure of knowledge as the exercise of power. And this begins with his mission to provide arguments to defend his decision to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry the beautiful courtier Anne Boleyn. And he identifies a man called John Leland, who's been kind of written out of history, unfortunately. Well, not written out of history, but he's been sort of neglected. And if any of you have read Hilary Mantel's trilogy, he's right out of Hilary Mantel, because he's charged by Henry VIII to undertake a laborious journey in search of antiquities. And that means traveling to libraries. And this is, of course, in the era before the dissolution of the monasteries. And there are hundreds of libraries in Britain with great collections in them. And John Leland is a great kind of bookish man, and he visits. We have his archive in the Bodleian, unfortunately, these notes, so we know exactly what was going through his mind as he visited, for example, the library of Glastonbury Abbey, and he'd been looking forward to going there for ages. And he says, I crossed the threshold, and at the mere sight of the books, I swooned. So, he lost his... He lost his shit, ladies and gentlemen, at the sight of these books. I totally get where he's coming from. I'm sure you do too, yeah. Mike. Yeah. But those books that he found there were to find arguments that the king could use to divorce Catherine of Aragon. And then the arguments get bigger, to separate from papal authority as a whole, to establish himself as the head of the church, to acquire all the massive wealth of the monasteries and the religious orders. So books are absolutely at the heart of that, both to craft arguments, but then to destroy the religious ideas that those books contained, that he had decided then that he wanted to kind of not quite start from scratch, but to heavily edit what the religious doctrines of the land would be.
As an American, I learned in high school about how the British burned the Library of Congress in 1813.
I'm sorry, folks. Let me declare an apology publicly here in Tulane University.
But I bring this up because you tell the full story in your book, Burning the Books, of the destruction of knowledge during that war. And something happened before the British burnt the Library of Congress. And we weren't taught this in American elementary school. Do you want to, full disclosure?
There was a library in what is now Canada, in the city of York, what is now Toronto, where the American forces destroyed the library there. And I don't think there's, it wasn't retaliation for that, I don't think, but it's a symbol of libraries being on the battleground for grander kind of political efforts. But certainly the destruction of the Library of Congress was a deliberate act. There is an extraordinary eyewitness account from actually an Oxford alum called George Gleig, who wrote a book about it. And even he wrote that although he said the burning of Washington was a scene nothing more sublime that he could remember having seen, he said that the destruction of the Congress building and the noble library within it was something to be regretted. And he could see that the library was something which the nation needed to govern its country. To the administrators of the houses needed them to run the affairs of state, and that was a step too far. Even a member of the British forces felt that. So, and of course, it becomes the trigger for that renewal. When I spoke about the destruction of knowledge, it's often followed by these acts of renewal, of reinvigoration, and this becomes, something that Thomas Jefferson, having retired to Monticello, hears about the burning of the library and offers his own private library, easily the best in the United States at the time, to replace the lost books. And Congress spends months debating. It's quite interesting to read the debates, whether they should vote the money to buy, because Jefferson doesn't give the library, he sells it at kind of mates rates. And eventually they decide, 7,000 books we're going to buy, and that becomes the new National Library of the United States and the Library of Government, and this kind of unique combination that you have here.
I don't know if Carl Bernstein is here, but of course in the film All the President's Men, the actor playing Carl Bernstein has a scene with the actor playing Bob Woodward, his colleague at the Washington Post, breaking the Watergate story, where they're sitting in the magnificent reading room of the Library of Congress, and they have an archive of borrowing slips in front of them, thousands upon thousands of borrowing slips. And they're trying to demonstrate that the White House was involved in borrowing certain books from the library, and they're going through meticulously. I see Jason Berry out there. That paper archive would not exist today, would it?
No, but the records would be, and I don't think that I'm certainly not somebody who fixates about the decline of paper.
Yeah.
I like these things, don't get me wrong, but the digital world in which we're all surrounded is just as important to preserve. It's the record of culture, it's the record of events, and so much of our lives are played out in it today that we neglect the preservation of that digital world at our peril, particularly now when so much of our communications take place on platforms that are owned by what my colleague in Oxford, Timothy Garton-Ash, calls private superpowers. And they're a bit like, as a medievalist, I liken the major tech companies to the Roman Catholic Church of the Middle Ages. They cover many countries, they don't respond particularly to any one jurisdiction, they have immense wealth, they have great power, and they can read our souls.
Yeah, they're a power and principality unto themselves.
Yeah, but they control so much of this communication that we need to be wary of how we use those technologies, the kinds of information that we're willing to give up to them, to allow them to monopolize, commercialize, and to kind of fire back at us.
Well, in fact, I was struck by, I think I can remember the exact page in your book where you refer to this fact, page 214 in my copy. You talk about how the Pew Charitable Trust ran a survey back in 2016, I think, concerning public attitudes toward libraries and toward the information that libraries preserve and make available to the public. And something like 78% of the people who took this survey indicated a profound trust in public libraries. And when you set that alongside, as you do in your book, this distrust, a very wise distrust that we have of these privatized archives now and sources of knowledge, that's quite a striking figure.
Yeah, and I think that trust has taken millennia to build up. And, there are so many examples of where, particularly since the development of the public library systems in many countries, in the UK, this begins in 1850 not as a requirement, but as the the right for local government to levy taxes in order to supply public libraries, this idea of free knowledge, the ability to self-educate, to take responsibility for finding information, and also where anybody is treated the same in a library and they're not bombarded with the necessity to spend money. They can do so in an environment that's conducive to education and to learning, but also places where the lives of communities, local history is kept and nurtured, and that relationship between local libraries. And I was hearing about Tulane here and the special collections on jazz and the local community, local culture. These relationships are based on trust. And that trust takes a long time to build up, but it can be easily destroyed. And I think librarians have a particularly challenging role in this age today, when we have, if you like, competition from commercial organizations, where we have layers of regulation, and also we have contested issues which libraries are at the heart. So it's a difficult role that libraries are placed at the moment.
One of my own experience with your library, with the Bodleian over many years now, makes me think that one of the reasons I trust libraries, and trust a library like the Bodleian, and trust the information that I get there, has to do with the human connection.
Yep.
That is I hadn't met you before you visited New Orleans, but I knew of you at the Bodleian because you did a very good turn for me back in 2018 when I was stuck negotiating with them about some photographs for my book published in 2019, and you stepped in and said, to my editor, leave this with me, and the problem was solved overnight. So that's a story of service, and one that encourages trust in the institution. But everybody I've met over the years at the Bodleian, once I had that reader's ticket, trusted me as a scholar, and
Yep.
I trusted them to provide me with just a wealth of institutional and personal information about the library and its
Yep.
holdings. What do you think about that human connection in libraries?
I couldn't agree more, but I full disclosure, ladies and gentlemen, I would not be here now if it wasn't for the public library in the town that I grew up in. My parents were not wealthy, they're working class, we didn't have books at home, and my mother took me to the public library, to the children's section when I was that high, and every week for the rest of my kind of childhood, I went to the library. That was what you did, and I was helped by librarians, and when I was able just to self-serve, I browsed the collections, I found knowledge, I read books I'd never knew that existed or that I would be interested in, and I borrowed music. I listened to my first classical music. My mum and dad would listen to Frank Sinatra at home, but never classical. So, that was absolutely transformational for me, not just in my intellectual growth, but in my life chances. So, librarians often have these experiences, and they want to make sure, on the whole, there are exceptions, but they want to make sure that their patrons have the same opportunities that they do.
Yeah, we were talking before coming over here about my background as well, which is very similar to yours. Growing up in a working class household, my dad belonged to something, I think it was an American phenomenon, the Book of the Month Club. So he had a small library. He would receive a book, a popular novel every month, or a book of history, and he had these very proudly on a shelf. But the local public library for me was a real haven. And you write in your book about, in your coda to your book, about how one of the very important things that a library represents is a fixed point in this kind of swirling, confusing, chaotic universe of information. Maybe you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, so I think in my book at the end, Mike's referring to a coda where I describe kind of 5 functions of libraries and archives that society benefits from. And one of those is about libraries and archives being fixed points for truth and facts. And in an age where there's disinformation, misinformation, where it's becoming increasingly contested about alternate facts or whatever sphere of knowledge you care to mention, having that documented, referenceable, citable, revisitable record of who said what, or what ideas were put forward, that society can revisit and check and verify. These are important things that we lose sight of, and I talk about even things like, which I use all the time, and value greatly, and Wikipedia. There are so many instances of Wikipedia entries being constantly rewritten to remove evidence. Unfortunately, in the UK, there was a period of scandals where members of parliament were abusing the expenses system in parliament. And a lot of members of parliament were charged and fined for their abuse of this system. And so what you find is that their staff in their parliamentary offices were removing the references in Wikipedia to them having had this kind of, rather disreputable part of their past. And Wikipedia now have to employ a system where they track Wikipedia entries in order to rewrite these truths back into, into that reference source. So these are, actually having information that can be trusted, even having sources of information which we know are false, but where metadata cataloging, the kind of role that librarians have in tracking the provenance of information, describing it accurately, so that people who come back in the future to look these things up can know and rely on the information that they're seeing. Now, this is a big task, it's expensive, it takes time, but it's worth society investing in it. And I think at the end of my book, I quote from Orwell's 1984, which I recommend you go back and reread, because it's really about the age we live in now. It's not about 1948 when he wrote the book. And there's this chilling phrase, the past was erased, the erasure was forgotten, the lie became truth. And I think my kind of central thesis is that libraries and archives, when they work well, are organizations that help society cling to the truth.
So you've raised the issue by way of your Wikipedia example of censorship. A lot of your book talks about the deliberate destruction of large-scale collections of information. Censorship is often a very focused, hyper-deliberate activity, very minute in its operations. I suppose censors, because they believe in what they're doing in a kind of perverse way, regard themselves as curators of the truth. So there's a kind of twisted idea of curation behind censorship, but censorship is coming back in a big way. On both sides of the Atlantic, we've got kids' books being edited. We have, of course, the culture wars in America, and the battle lines being drawn around, what should be read, what shouldn't be read, what should be taught, what shouldn't be taught. How do librarians and libraries figure in this landscape?
Well, as you say, censorship is once again all the rage, if you'll pardon the pun. Yeah. And I think in my coda, one of the 5 functions of libraries and archives for society I suggest is about a diversity of knowledge. John Stuart Mill, in his amazing book on liberty, says, without the diversity of opinion and knowledge, in the present state of human intellect, we won't have a chance at the fair play of the truth. So we need to have a diversity of opinion in our society. It's absolutely a pillar of democracy, of open society, and libraries play an important part in allowing this diverse opinions, diverse knowledge to be preserved and accessible, even if it is very challenging. You know, you can come into the Bodleian Library and read copies of Mein Kampf. We are not proponents of that book in any way, shape, or form, but it is important that it's available to students and scholars and society to be able to come and read what that person said in that book, which was so influential. And so we need to allow for the widest possible expression of human opinion and ideas. Censorship should be resisted. Of course, we should fall short at things which incite hatred, which are incite violence. Those things are not permissible, but we have to make it possible for that wide range of opinion to be aired, because otherwise we will lose that fundamental aspect of the diversity of opinion, which is central to a democratic, open society.
When I was an undergraduate at a small Jesuit college in Philadelphia at that time, in the mid-1970s, there were still books that were on the Catholic Index, this index of prohibited books. And in the library, you could see them. They were in the stacks, but they were locked up, behind a cage. And you could go in there and ask for one, and they would unlock the cage and bring it out to you. But there was a whole kind of performative dimension to what was going on there. And a lot of censorship, I think, is about not just censoring something, but showing that you're able to do it.
Yeah, it's the exercise of power. Absolutely. But it's always been misguided, in my view, throughout history. So in my own institution, which was founded, Sir Thomas Bodley was a Protestant. He established the library with a kind of Protestant ideology. My predecessor, the first librarian and the 25th, was a pretty ardent Protestant. They actually used the Roman Catholic Index as a shopping list. They were the books that they most wanted to read, because the job of finding out what the kind of racier books, theologically speaking, were had all been done for them by these Roman Catholic censors, and that's still today. I don't know if any of you read Margaret Atwood's article in The Atlantic a couple of weeks ago, urging people to ban her books because sales have never been better. So I think there's a great history of censorship being, really backfiring on the censor.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah. I think I own a copy of each of the books on the Roman Catholic Index. I've acquired them over the years, just in case,
Yeah.
One of the chapters in your book, and this is the last question I'll ask you, because we want to take some questions from the audience, is very troubling to read, because it's about an author who I much admire, Franz Kafka, whose dying wish was to self-censor. He wanted most of his personal and literary archive to be destroyed. And his friend and literary executor, Max Brod, agreed to this, made a pledge. But then, thank heavens for those of us who love to read Kafka, once Kafka was dead and buried, he reneged on it. Could you talk about that in connection with, who does knowledge belong to? Does it belong to an author who created it? Does it belong to the public? Does it belong to his literary executor? This is a very complex topic, but
yeah, it's a complicated and very kind of nuanced area. Of course, looking back from hindsight, Kafka's at the time of his death, his unpublished writings have since become parts of world culture. Next year is the centenary of Kafka's death. We're doing a big exhibition. It'll come to New York later next year, ladies and gentlemen. And we all have benefited as human beings greatly from reading Kafka. And I think that Max Brod knew that there were great riches there, and his decision to disobey Kafka was about the future. And I think libraries and archives are about the present and the future. They're not about the past. And although that wasn't the decision of a library that Max Brod made, it was made in a kind of similar spirit. And he came up with his own argument, saying, Franz Kafka knew that I could never go through and destroy his notebooks. So he wasn't serious when he said, you must destroy my notebooks, because he knew that I could never do it. And so he kind of justified it in that own way. But thank God that he didn't, because we wouldn't have had all this great literature, which has been so influential in other writers and has enriched our culture so much.
I agree with you, and looking to the future on that hopeful note, we can look to the audience now for some questions. Here's one over here from...
There's a microphone, I think, to come up and stand.
Oh, yeah, step up and...
There's microphones on both sides.
Yeah, if you have a question, please approach one of these two microphones.
Hi there. I don't know if everyone can hear me. Thank you for being here. I'm really curious, as someone who, you were talking a lot about how when power gets into the wrong hands, the first thing that it targets is repositories of knowledge. And I'm interested about the relationship of that idea with kind of this idea of trust in the institutions that keep that knowledge. I mean, this especially hits close to home here in Louisiana, where we have a governmental and public support for banning things like the novels of Toni Morrison in our public libraries. And so I'm wondering, as someone who wants to go into a field of tending to knowledge, to be a librarian, when the forces of power are acting on you as someone working within an institution, how, as servants to literature, to humanity, do we try and negotiate those interests of power and preserving knowledge?
Well, I think we have to sort of enter the public sphere. We cannot be sort of meek and silent, this kind of sort of stereotypical idea of the librarian being sort of, socially, reserved and all of this rubbish. I cannot tell you how much I hate those kind of stereotypes, but we have to live up to the role that we have been given by society, and by standing up for those principles and organizing, we must, and there are fantastic examples of how libraries in the US are doing that now by making those banned books available electronically. The New York Public and Brooklyn Public Libraries are doing fantastic work in that sphere by organizing, but it's about the decision makers. Who are the decision makers? We need to be speaking to them. We need to be educating voters. We need to be telling our story loudly and as repeatedly as we possibly can about the importance of these roles, this kind of place that we have in our communities, because we can't just allow that authoritarianism to kind of be weighed down upon us without resisting it and using the legitimate means that we have at our disposal to do that fighting back. And there's a wonderful story in my own institution, which was my predecessor, the fifth librarian, who was told by the government to go and burn the copies of John Milton, who was one of the regicides in the 1670s. This edict came out, and he hid a special copy of Milton's works that Milton had presented to the library earlier, and he refused to give it up to the flames. And that inspires me, and I think young librarians, new professionals, need to be inspired by these great stories of the past and to fight back and resist.
Thank you.
I like this idea of the activist librarian. It's a question over here on the left.
Richard, when I came in today, I probably thought that the advent of the virtual world or the digital world made it harder to destroy knowledge, but you made a number of good points where it can be done in an either invisible or subtle way. Do you think it's a greater danger today that knowledge is destroyed in a virtual world rather than in the physical world that we would have had to be done in the past?
I would say there is a risk that that is the case. If you look, we archive the whole of the UK web domain annually as part of our legal responsibilities under primary legislation with 5 other libraries in the UK jointly. And we've been doing it since 2014, and 40% of the URLs that we preserved in 2014 are no longer there in 2021. So the web is a fragile platform. If you want to preserve something, don't put it online, or don't just rely on it being online to being the act of preservation. And then also, when we're reliant on platforms that are managed by commercial organizations for our pictures in Flickr or our Facebook posts or what our Twitter accounts, thinking about changes to, corporate policy, these then become subject to commercial decisions that are not made by us as individuals. And so those domains of knowledge kept in major social media platforms or other forms of cloud services are vulnerable to changes in decisions that are made not by society as a whole, but by, for particularly, often for legitimate reasons, business models changing and so on, but they can see, masses of information being destroyed quite readily. So that's why digital preservation has to be part of the armory of society through libraries and archives to preserve, culture, world culture that's happening all around us right now.
Question over here.
Thank you. This isn't so much about the destruction of knowledge, but how knowledge is made available. So my local library, it's kind of a low-income neighborhood in New Orleans, and it's very small, and you go in and there's tons of computers, which is fabulous, and there's old and young and everybody on the computers. But the stacks are tiny. And it's like there's so many stories of a kid wandering around the library and discovering things that they weren't looking for. And what do you think about sort of the loss of that, being able to just wander around and find something that you weren't searching for on a computer?
I think it varies from institution, from local context to local context. Sometimes it's about how librarians with scarce resources can best serve their communities. Sometimes doing that electronically because they have pressure on the amount of space they have, or for a variety of other reasons, digital is the way to go. And so many people consume information in digital form. But I definitely think that there are many cases where that serendipity, the kind of tactile sense of a room full of books is something which I would like to preserve for future generations to have that same experience that I had, and that obviously you and other people have. So, like all things, there's a balance to be struck, but I don't think there's a kind of a binary issue here.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Awesome, I get to be it. So I actually just read 1984, and it is striking. Can everybody hear me? It is striking, the relationship it has with today. I get the impression that one of the problems that we're having with censorship and with the destruction or alteration of knowledge comes down ultimately to the centralization of platforms. The majority of the web is on AWS and Amazon, and basically owned by Amazon. All of our communication now is done via social media. We only have 2 different types of system to even talk to each other via phones. And then as far as publishers, it's also a striking lack of diversity in publishers. 1984, in fact, is actually published by Penguin. Their subsidiary, Puffin, are the ones that recently had a bunch of controversy over changing the works of Roald Dahl. So in terms of document control and document preservation, How can we work towards a decentralized system where there's a greater chance for that diversity to continue to remain and to help fight against that censorship?
Well, that's an excellent question. And I think it's something which we struggle with in my end of the knowledge industry, if you like, which is about over-dependence on a small number of very powerful suppliers of knowledge in various forms, either the infrastructure, as you say, like Amazon Web Services, or the publishing industry, which has become conglomerated into major, very, very powerful corporations, which have benefits as well. It means that, books can become made available at scale, it can be cheaper, and, there are pluses to that too. But I think we have to be mindful of the need to replicate knowledge. There's an acronym in library, LOCKS. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. So having replicated print collections in many libraries around the world has actually served society quite well. It may not be the most efficient way of doing it, but it actually has benefits, and we need to think about that. Not putting every library putting all of its digital information in the same cloud supplier, but thinking about backup routines, off-site replication, all of these things which we have to look at, and so that issue is a very, very important one. Thank you for raising it.
We're out of time, so please join with me in thanking Richard.